The order came at the worst possible moment. Not early, not late, exactly when it shouldn't have. Stand down. It cut through the channel like it was final, like nothing else needed to be said. And for a second, everyone followed it, except her. If you've ever known something was wrong, even when the order was clear, type, "Not this time" below. Military operations at night carry a specific quality of pressure. Not louder than daylight operations, quieter, in most ways. The absence of natural light removes a layer of sensory information that humans unconsciously rely on, and what replaces it is a kind of concentrated, instrument-dependent focus. Every data feed matters more. Every reading carries more weight. Every anomaly requires more deliberate attention because the environment no longer offers the casual confirmation of just looking out a window. Night operations are not more dangerous because of darkness alone. They're more demanding because they require a higher degree of trust in information that cannot be immediately verified. The operation had been running for several hours. It was not a crisis situation, not in the dramatic, visible sense. There was no active emergency, no obvious escalation, no event that would have caused an outside observer to immediately understand the stakes. It had the particular texture of something that was still in motion without yet having declared what it would become: operational, ongoing, with the careful, sustained attention of people who understood that the current state was not necessarily the final one. She had been watching it for most of those hours. Around 35, positioned at a station that gave her access to multiple data streams simultaneously. She was not the senior officer in the room. She was not the one with authority over the operation's direction. But she had been present since the beginning, which meant she had the kind of granular, accumulated understanding of the situation's behavior that no briefing document and no status report could fully transmit. The understanding that comes from watching something develop in real time, from noting the small, early signals that only mean something in retrospect, from building a picture not from any single data point, but from the relationship between many of them over time. Then, the order came. It arrived through the command channel with the clean authority that orders carry when they originate at a level of command that doesn't explain itself, because at that level, explanation is not part of the protocol. Stand down. 2 words, structured as a direction, carrying the full institutional weight of the command structure behind them. Units began responding immediately. That was the design. The protocol existed precisely to produce rapid, unified compliance, and it was working as intended. Systems began their shutdown sequences. Status indicators shifted from active to standby. The room's energy, which had been taut and concentrated, began to decompress with the particular relief of people who have been released from sustained alertness. She didn't confirm. Not refusal, nothing as direct or as obvious as that. She simply didn't add her confirmation to the sequence moving through the channel. Her hands remained where they were. Her screen remained active. Her attention, which had been continuous for hours, continued without interruption, because in the data in front of her, something was still moving. A minor reading, the kind that didn't have a flag attached to it. That wasn't the sort of anomaly the system was designed to surface automatically. But it was there, a small, specific inconsistency in the pattern she had been watching long enough to understand, and it wasn't resolving. It hadn't finished. She understood exactly what her hesitation meant. There was no ambiguity in the institutional arithmetic. An order had been issued through the correct channel by the correct authority using the correct language, and the correct response was compliance. That was not a complicated equation. The entire operational structure she worked within depended on that equation being solved the same way, every time, by everyone in the system, because the alternative, a framework in which individuals could selectively delay compliance based on personal assessment, was a framework that would eventually fail in ways far more consequential than the failure she was trying to prevent. She knew this. She also knew what she was looking at on her screen. If she was wrong, if the signal she was tracking resolved itself in the next few minutes into something benign, into instrument noise or a data artifact or any of the dozen unremarkable explanations that most anomalies turn out to have, then she had delayed compliance with a direct order. With no justification the chain of command would find satisfactory. The consequences of that were not abstract. They were professional, procedural, real. If she was right, if the thing she was watching was what she suspected it was, still active, still unresolved, in a system that was in the process of standing down, then what she didn't do in the next 2 minutes could not be undone afterward. The 2 possibilities sat in front of her with equal weight. Others in the room had begun to notice. Not dramatically, nobody was pointing or raising voices or doing anything that would announce a problem. But attention was the kind of currency that gets spent in environments like this one, and hers had been noticed and its direction registered. A few people were watching her the way you watch someone who isn't moving when movement is expected, with the low, specific unease of something that doesn't match the pattern. The command channel came through again. Confirmation requested. The prompt was procedural, neutral in tone, carrying the baseline authority of a system checking that the process was completing as intended. The hardest decisions aren't between right and wrong, they're between following orders and knowing something isn't over. If you've ever had to choose under pressure, type "I'd wait" below. She didn't confirm. She didn't shut down the data stream. She didn't close the window she was watching. She left active the single thread of monitoring that the stand-down order should have terminated, and she held her position in front of it, and she said nothing. The room's unease sharpened. In a system built on synchronized response, one person maintaining a separate cadence becomes visible quickly. It's not a loud disruption, it doesn't announce itself with alarm or confrontation, but it sits in the awareness of everyone around it like a note slightly out of key in an otherwise unified sound, just wrong enough to notice, just present enough to matter. She was aware of all of it. She didn't move, because the signal on her screen was still moving, quiet, steady, unresolved, and until it wasn't, she wasn't going to be the person who had the information and looked away from it because the process said it was time to stop looking. The channel was preparing to escalate. She could feel it in the room's quality of attention, the particular gathering stillness of a system about to demand an answer it expected to receive. And then, before it could, something else arrived entirely. The system changed without warning. Not catastrophically, there was no alarm, no sudden cascade of failures, no event that announced itself through any of the dramatic channels that systems use to signal distress. The change was quieter and more fundamental than that. It was the change that happens when something at a level of the architecture that most people in a given room have never directly interacted with makes a decision and communicates it downward through every layer simultaneously. The screens shifted. Not all of them and not in the same way, but the screens that mattered, the ones displaying the command structure, the authorization hierarchy, the operational status indicators updated with the clean, instantaneous finality of a system receiving new instructions from a source it recognized as authoritative. The access level at the top of the command display changed, and then a line appeared. Override. Priority command. The room didn't react loudly. Rooms like this one don't. As a rule, the training that produces people who function well under operational pressure also produces people who process unexpected information without immediately externalizing the processing. But the quality of silence changed. The silence before the override had been the silence of a room waiting for a confirmation that wasn't coming. The taut, impatient quiet of a system one step short of enforcement. The silence after was different. It was the silence of a room that had just received more information than it had been expecting and was now reassembling its picture of the situation around a central fact that hadn't been present 30 seconds earlier. The stand-down order, the command that had moved through the channel with the full authority of its originating level, that had initiated shutdown sequences across multiple units, that had been moments away from triggering an escalation over one person's refusal to confirm, had not been the final word. It had been issued at a level that was, itself, subordinate to something else, and that something else had just intervened. The new command structure that populated across the screens was not a reversal of the stand-down in any simple sense. It was a reconfiguration, the system being redirected rather than reversed, shifted from the state it had been in toward a different operational mode that the stand-down would have prevented, and that the override was now explicitly enabling. The data she had been watching, the signal that hadn't resolved, the small, persistent anomaly in the pattern that she had refused to look away from, was now visible on every screen in the room, not because she had put it there. Because the priority command had surfaced it, had pulled it into the shared display with the clarity of information that a higher authority had determined everyone present needed to see. It hadn't been noise. It hadn't been instrument drift or data artifact or any of the benign explanations that would have made her the person who delayed compliance for nothing. It was exactly what she had assessed it to be, still active, still unresolved, still requiring the kind of attention that a completed stand-down would have removed from it entirely. She stood in front of her station without speaking. She hadn't triggered the override. She had no access to that level of the command architecture, and she had made no attempt to reach it. What she had done was simpler and more specific than that. She had not shut down the monitoring thread that the priority command now confirmed had been worth maintaining. She had kept active the one piece of the system that the override needed to be active in order to do what it was now doing. Not by circumventing the order, by not completing it. Around her, the room's understanding was quietly, irreversibly updating. She didn't look at anyone. She didn't offer the small, sideways acknowledgement that would have been the social equivalent of saying, "I told you." She looked at the data on her screen, the data that had been there from the beginning, visible to anyone who had been watching long enough and carefully enough, and she watched it complete its resolution with the focused attention of someone who is still on duty, regardless of what the room has just realized about the preceding 20 minutes. The situation stabilized within the hour. The threat that the stand-down would have left unaddressed resolved cleanly, contained, managed, processed through the operational channels that the priority command had kept available. There was no escalation. There was no moment where the cost of the original order became visible in the stark, irreversible way that costs become visible when they're paid in full. The intervention had happened early enough, through the right mechanisms, with the right information maintained in the right state. The outcome was the best available version of events. Command did not acknowledge her specifically. There was no formal communication that referenced the stand-down delay or the monitoring thread she had maintained or the judgment call she had made in the minutes before the override arrived. The after-action documentation would reflect what happened operationally, the facts, the timeline, the result. What it would not reflect, because this was not the kind of thing that gets documented in after-action reports, was the texture of the decision she had made in a room full of people who were watching her and waiting for her to fall into line. Others in the room knew. They knew the way people know things in environments where the work is too important to leave room for social performance, not through celebration, not through the kind of explicit acknowledgement that requires an audience, but through the simple recalibration of how they registered her presence now compared to how they had registered it before. Something had updated in their model of the room and the people in it, and it wasn't going back. She didn't take credit. She didn't offer the explanation that the situation might have entitled her to offer the account of what she'd seen, when she'd seen it, why she'd made the assessment she'd made. She closed the monitoring thread when it was no longer needed. She updated her status through the correct channel. She returned to the position she'd been in before the order had come through and continued the work that remained. As if the preceding hour had simply been the work. The base operated the way it always did in the aftermath of a resolved situation, with the quiet, sustained efficiency of people who have moved through something and are now on the other side of it. Following orders keeps systems running. But knowing when not to, knowing when an order is incomplete, when the picture it was built on is missing a piece, when compliance in this specific moment costs something that can't be recovered afterward, that is what keeps systems from failing at the moments that matter most. The real authority isn't who gives the command. It's who understands when it's incomplete. Subscribe to Steelheart Stories, Emma, for more stories where the right decision isn't the easiest one.